Alright, so for our fourth example, I wanted to try and implement something I actually think is really cool about CodePen. You'll notice that you can resize these boxes, and when one of them becomes too small, the heading text up here actually gets smaller and moves over into that side panel. So here we have just a really simple web page with some sort of text, and we want to make it so that this heading does the same thing that CodePen does when the browser height gets to be too small. So let's think about how we could do that. First, let's start off by adjusting this heading class into the final state we want it to be. And to do that, we're actually going to use a new property called transform. If you've never used transform before, it's actually a really handy property that is extremely useful whenever you're working with animations. Do keep in mind the vendor prefixes, of course, when you're implementing it in your own web pages. But again, for this class, I'm assuming that you have the most up-to-date browser possible, whichever one you may use, and transform is supported in all up-to-date modern browsers without vendor prefixes. So let's just jump in and start using it. There's a lot of different possible values we can pass in. There's 2D transforms as well as 3D transforms, but we're going to keep it pretty simple for this example. So first, let's go in and select our heading, and we're going to just start applying transform properties to it. So first, we know we want it to rotate down about 90 degrees. To do that, we can just say 90 DEG for degrees. And you can see that it's already updated on the page, being rotated 90 degrees. But something weird's happening here. You'll notice that it's actually rotating at the center of this image, where really, if we want it to be coming down into this side bit here, we actually want it to be rotating from the beginning of the element. So how can we do that? There's actually a property we can use to set the origin of this transformation. If you work at all in programs like Photoshop or Illustrator, you probably know what I'm talking about when I say setting the origin point for a transformation. But if not, you'll be able to see really soon here. So let's go ahead and call this transform origin property, and we're going to set it to center because we want the height centered, but we want the horizontal aspect of it to be left. And now you can see that it's actually moved it over into this side panel here, because where it was transitioning from the center, it's now transitioning from the very leftmost point. So that text looks a little bit out of place there. And also we can see that this top bar here is still showing all of its space. And part of the whole reason for implementing this is when the browser height's too small, we want to be saving space. So let's go ahead and set the height of heading 1 to 0 pixels. And now that white space is removed. All right, so we're not finished transforming yet. Let's go ahead and pass in another value and scale down that text a little bit. So right now, it has a scale of 1, and let's adjust that to a scale of 0.5. And now it's a lot smaller. So finally, we need to figure out a way to get this text centered here. Obviously, we could do that with some positioning, but there's actually a built-in function in transform called translate, and what that does is it moves around an element by horizontal and vertical values, much like position. So we're just going to call translate, and we're going to pass in, let's just say 20 pixels to start with. And if we compare them, 0 and 20, we can see that it's just moving vertically for now. We also want to move it over horizontally. So let's add in negative 25 pixels. Now we can see that it's moved up a little bit. All right, so now the text is centered horizontally, but we still want it to be kind of aligned to this text box here vertically. So let's change that to 60. All right, so now we have the heading set to where we want it to go when the browser height is small enough. But now we actually need to add back in the default values. So let's make a media query. And we're going to say when the screen is any taller than 400 pixels, we're going to make some changes to H1. So we already know we're basically going to be undoing the transform that we did earlier on in the document. And so what we could do is go ahead and copy all this and paste it in here. Set the rotate to 0, set the scale back to 1, and set the translate to 0. And then when our screen is tall enough, it's back where it started. Or, to make things a little bit simpler, we can simply set the transform to its default value, and the same thing's happening. So also, we notice that when the screen is high enough, that height is still missing. So let's go ahead and add that back in. And we can actually do the same thing here and just say height initial. And now we're having it switch between these two states. So now that we have that set up, we can do something that's probably feeling a little bit familiar for you now and add in a transition to H1. So we're going to transition all of these properties that we're changing. Let's give it 0.38 seconds to do that. Let's let it ease. And now we're seeing some of that same functionality that CodePen has. I actually want to make it look like when this is changing, that text box is actually sliding up. So to do that, let's play around with the padding around this form group here. So let's go grab this out of the don't edit code and drop it up before a media query. And what I want to do is when things are actually collapsed like this, I want to set that top padding to 0 and leave the 20 pixel padding on the bottom and on the sides so that it's nice and square like that. But when it's expanded, set the padding to back. So now we're getting that nice space when we have it, and when we don't, it's collapsing. Let's add a transition to that to make it look like that text box is sliding up. So we're just going to say transition, padding. Let's give it half a second and set it to ease. And now it's actually going to look like that box is sliding up and down based on that text moving. There you go. You've completed example 4. And that's the end of the official examples. But if you want to play around with this some more, we're actually going to talk a little bit about this ease that we've been setting all our transitions to, and some ways we can actually play around with that to get some really snappy effects. So if you're interested in that, head on to the next section. But if not, feel free to skip ahead to the conclusion.